If you would open up to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. I'm not sure if we'll finish out the chapter today or not, but we'll give it a good try. In Matthew chapter 5, look at verse 20. And we're going to reiterate this perhaps a couple different times today. But Jesus makes a statement that to the people who were listening must have been just a gasp whenever they heard Jesus make this statement. If you can imagine the people that you looked up to religiously or spiritually to be told, look, if you do it like they do it, you won't make it. And almost take you back as if to wonder, can anybody make it? But notice Matthew 5:20. Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." He says, you're going to have to do it far better than they do. He says, if your righteousness is like theirs, he says, you're not going to make it eternally. You're not going to be part of the kingdom of heaven. And, of course, as he goes through the rest of the chapter, you get these statements of, you have heard it said. And Jesus quotes from the Old Testament in every single one of these. About you have heard it said. But then he flips it and says, but I say to you, and he takes them so much further down to the roots of what needs to be addressed, rather than what's just on the surface. In terms of looking at, well, I didn't kill anybody today. Yeah, but are you angry with them? Well, I haven't committed adultery today. Yeah, but what's going on inside the desires of your heart? And you go, well, we're still married. Well, God sent his wife away for being unfaithful. And to go, okay, are we addressing what needs to be addressed? Now, notice verse 33. Well, actually, before we get there, look over at Luke chapter 7. Let me show you a layer of this before we go too far. Luke chapter 7. I just want you to see this about the Pharisees, and what Jesus brings up later. Luke chapter 7, look down at verses 29 and 30. Jesus has just been talking about John the Baptist. There have been some disciples that came to him and asked him a question or two. Then at the end, this is his statement. Luke chapter 7, verse 29. When all the people and the tax collectors heard this, they acknowledged God's justice, having been baptized with the baptism of John. All these things that Jesus had brought up about John, what did it help the people to realize? God is going to be just. And whenever you consider that God is going to be just, does that usually make us go, oh, this is going to be easy? Or does it really make us look on the inside, going, what needs to be dealt with here? And if you notice the groups that he brings out here, he says, when all the people, and then he adds on, and the tax collectors. Now, it's not as if the tax collectors aren't included in all the people, but you kind of see this qualifying statement go like all the people, even the tax collectors. Like even the people that everybody looks down on. Even they were coming, which is kind of unique because who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? A tax collector, which is really a blatantly wonderful thought of going, he's saying, look, the scribes and the Pharisees aren't going to make it. He says, but can a tax collector make it? Yeah, if he'll recognize the justice of God. And notice, because of this acknowledgement of God's justice, it says, having been baptized with the baptism of John, they responded to what John taught them. They said, you know what, we really do have to change. We have to change how we do things. We can't just live our lives however we want. Now, here's another aspect of this, of going, can you remember the moment you realized the justice of God? That moment whenever we were still outside of Christ and we realized, you know what, sin has caused a separation between me and God. And that has to be dealt with. Because what was John's baptism really pointing toward? Pointing toward Jesus, specifically being a baptism about repentance. There's got to be a change of thinking and you know what? There's a confession of sin, of realizing I'm not doing what's right. Whenever you see God's justice, you can see the hunger and desire to go, I want to learn who this one that John's talking about is in being Jesus. Now, look at the flip side of this coin. Verse 30. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves, not having been baptized by John. How are they doing? Not good at all. And if you notice, it says they even rejected God's purpose for themselves. What was God's purpose for them? Same. Listen to John and acknowledge the justice of God. And acknowledge that you need to change too. Yet, how did they go about this? They rejected God's purpose. Now, if you want a parallel for us nowadays, it's like saying, boy, I read my Bible every day, but I don't change anything in my life. I don't address anything that I see that I'm not doing in the right direction. Isn't that rejecting God's purpose for us? And going, here they were, they rejected God's purpose for them, and they were not even going to respond to what God was doing through John. Can you understand why Jesus makes his statement back in Matthew 5? If you're going to be like them and you're going to make up your own rules, he says, you're not going to make it. You're going to have to acknowledge the justice of God. Now, come back to Matthew chapter 5 and look at verse 33 now. He says again, and you notice, all right, let's go through this again, as if we haven't already been through this a couple times. He says, again you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. Now, who are the ancients? Think about it. Where's this quoted from? It's 3 different places in the Old Testament, but just generally, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, who are those books written to specifically, originally? Israel in the wilderness, right? So who are the ancients? Israel, from the time of the wilderness, even moving forward. Now, you might not think of them as being ancients because there are people who were older than that in Genesis, but here's how Jesus sees it. And so he says, you have heard the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. Doesn't that sound great? Doesn't that sound sufficient? And yet, I'm going to read it. We don't have to go back through and turn to all these, but I'll read them to you. And I'll tell you, if you're a note taker, you can write these down. This is Leviticus 19:12. You shall not swear falsely by my name so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So if somebody is going to swear falsely by God's name, who are you profaning? God. Isn't it interesting? He doesn't say, well, you're just profaning yourself. He says, no, you're profaning me. If you're going to be my people, then you're going to have to honor my commands. And here he says, if you're going to swear falsely by my name, he says, so as to profane the name of your God, he says, I am the Lord. What do you hear when it says, I am the Lord? I don't know if you ever did this. I'm not so sure how I feel about it. But when you have children and they say, why do I have to do this? Oh, I see you said it too. Because I am your mother, I am your father, and sometimes you realize that's all that needs to be said. It doesn't have to be an explanation at this point in time. Explain it to you later. But going, here's this statement of going, I am the Lord. That is not up for debate. The question is, are you going to profane my name or are you going to honor my name? He says, that's what's really being addressed here. Now, here's another quotation. Numbers chapter 30. This is verse 2. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. If you make the vow, what's the responsibility? You have to keep it. He says, he shall not violate his word. Now, Numbers chapter 30 is a very unique chapter to read, and it's really marvelous in the fact of it shows authority in attempts about making vows. And so it makes statements about if your children make vows, but you hear about it as a father or parent, he says, you can negate what they vowed as long as the first time you hear about it. He says, now if you let it go, it's going to be valid. Same thing goes for a husband and a wife, and you realize there are times where we make promises, and then all of a sudden you're reading through God's word and you go, you know what, I shouldn't keep that promise. And you go, all right, there's honoring God. And that's really what Numbers 30 is about. But you notice here, he says, he shall not violate his word. If you make a vow, know you have bound it upon yourself. Rose. Read Numbers 30, and you'll see that picture a lot more clearly. I encourage you to read it. The first time I read Numbers 30, I was like, wow, that's awesome. But Deuteronomy 23, here's our third. Deuteronomy 23, it's really verses 21 through 23. It says, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. You should be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised. He says, even to delay a promise is a sin. And then he says, but if you don't make the promise, guess what? It's no sin. He says, in other words, be wise in what you promise to do. Don't go around, oh yeah, I'll do that for you. And then all of a sudden, days, weeks, months go by. Hey, I thought you were gonna, oh yeah, I forgot all about that. What does that say? Even to ourselves, it didn't have any weight. We forgot about it. So be careful with what we promise. Now, you see the quotation from all of these of going, you voluntarily vowed it, so you have to perform it now. So you come back here to Matthew 5, when he says, the ancients were told, he says, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. You go, they had heard this over and over and over again. Now, notice verse 34. But I say to you, make no oath at all. Oh, none? That's kind of interesting. Now, if you pull these things together, you go, all right, keep your word. Why is it so valuable that this is where Jesus is and telling these people? Because what does this tell you about who God is? If he makes a promise, what do you know? He will keep it. And will he delay over it? No. Now, there are times we have to be patient, but don't think he's just making me wait to make me wait. No. There are things that have to come together first. And you realize, oh, this is the God we serve. And to go, this is such a comfort to know that whenever God makes a promise, he says, if I were not to keep it, I would profane my own name. And I'm not going to do that. And so it should give us some extra conviction and hope in anything that we see God promise. Here, as he makes this application, In 34, it says, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God. Have you ever wondered about a good description for what heaven is? What does he tell us? It's the throne of God. And who's talking here? You think he understands this? He's been there. He says, this is the description of heaven. Is that always the way we think of heaven? No. So often it becomes so fleshly, like it's where I'll get to do all my favorite things. You know, there's some people who would not be happy in heaven. Do you know that? Because they don't consider anything to be about the throne of God. He says, and if they were there, they wouldn't like it until they realize the alternative. Now, here's Jesus, though. People were going along and making these vows and say, I vow this by heaven. Oh, do you have any control over what happens in heaven? No. Then, verse 35, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, which is kind of something. I don't know if you've ever seen any of these ornate footstools. I mean, it seemed like in older years, people would carve out, designs in the wood and things. And you think, this earth, this world, for God is what? A footstool. Now, have you ever seen a footstool you thought, I'd like to live there? No. But to understand, you look at the majesty of what God has put on earth and his creation, and to go, this is just a footstool. That should tell us a little something. But for them, they were making vows like, I vow this by the planet Earth. It's just a footstool. It's just a footstool. Then he continues on. He says, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. He says, people are making vows by Jerusalem. That's not your city. I mean, that's like saying, I promise on my neighbor's house. You have no control over your neighbor's house, right? It could get really, really extreme. But notice here, he says, or by Jerusalem, the city of peace, for it is the city of the great king. Now, who did Israel consider to be the great king? David. You might even say Solomon, but that's the picture. It comes out of Psalm 48. Then verse 36, nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Now, I'm going to give you something that's not literally in the text, just so be careful with it. But really isn't the idea here, nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot naturally make one hair white or black. Isn't that really the idea here? Yeah, because we know. We know. Now, here's the picture of going, he says, you can't even change the simplest things naturally. It's not in your control. He says, and you're going to make these great big vows about great, grandiose things that you're going to do. He says, you can't even change the simple things naturally. Then, verse 37, what's the outcome of all this? He says, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. He says, it should really just be that simple. Let your yes be yes. If I tell you I will do it, yes, then you will see the outcome that the answer was yes, because it's finished and done. He says, if I tell you, no, I'm not going to do that, and then you see the outcome, nope, still hadn't done it. He says, that shouldn't surprise you. Right. You think about in those situations, and what I think of, this is just a conscience thing, not a principle here, but going, I give you my word. That should be sufficient. Because what I'm doing in this courtroom is no different than what I would do any other place. I'm going to tell the truth always. It's not like, well, now that I'm here and there's other people around, okay, if I have to, I'll tell the truth. You go, I give you my word. And you realize, does it make it a sin to say, do you swear to, I'm going to give my word? And you go, You say that and they'll accept it. And you go on. And even if you said, I do, fantastic. You're going to give the truth. Now, here's the real thing I want you to key in on. At the end of verse 37. Anything beyond these is of evil. Why? Why? Swear by heaven or the earth or Jerusalem or my own head. All right, you have control. You can even think in terms of saying, why is this going to make it different? You've been around enough people in your life to know those people who come up to you and they say, oh, I promise, I'll do anything. What does it automatically do to you? Uh-oh. If you have to go that far out, that means your track record's probably not pretty good. Right? And you go, all you got to do is just say yes or no. And you'll hold to it or you won't. But your life will be the evidence of whether you're going to do it or not. You know the kind of people who, whenever they tell you yes, what do you automatically know? It will be done, and it will be done in a timely manner. There's some people who could swear by everything under the sun, and it would not make you believe them anymore. Because you know. Look, that's why he says anything beyond this is of evil. If you feel like you have to impress somebody with some special way of saying yes or no, then you're probably not doing it right to begin with. Because we probably haven't been faithful in what we said. Now, let me show you what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing with this. Look over at Matthew 23. Matthew 23. Start down in verse 16. Remember what Jesus has already said, and I think you'll understand exactly why he makes those statements when you see what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing. Matthew 23, verse 16. Woe to you, blind guides. What a great way to say hello. Which tells you, were the Pharisees not guides? Yeah, they were. But here's the problem. How was their spiritual sight? They're blind. They were just blind. It's kind of like asking somebody who's colorblind, what color is this? Well, this is not going to turn out well. Well, here he goes. He says, woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. What was their approach to this deal? This one doesn't matter. You're really not obligated if you swear by the temple. But if you swear by the gold of the temple, then you're obligated. Huh? If you go back, maybe whenever you were younger, maybe other people, they make some promise, and then they say, oh, I was crossing my fingers. I don't have to keep my promise. What is that? Deception? Evil? And to go, sometimes you see kids do that, and you go, where'd you learn that from? Dad. We'll throw Dad under the bus today. But you realize some of those things, sometimes say, I learned it from another kid at school. I learned it from a cousin, whatever. But usually that kind of behavior has to be learned. Well, who had Israel learned this stuff from? The scribes and the Pharisees. And notice, it's not just this one thing. Look at verse 17. He says, you fools. Fools? I thought we couldn't call people fools. But he's talking about, here's a response. Now, is this going to come out of anger, what he's saying? No. He's putting the truth in front of them. He says, you fools and blind men. Once again, calls them blind. You can't see anything, can you? He says, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? He says, you're saying the gold is what makes it obligatory. He says, Have you thought about that gold really doesn't mean anything without a temple to sanctify it and make it holy? He says, even in your tricks of things, you don't make sense. Then verse 18, and whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You can just imagine people swearing by all kinds of things. They're swearing by the temple, they're swearing by the offering, swearing by the altar, they're swearing by the gold. I mean, you go, what was going on among these Pharisees and scribes? Apparently they weren't known for keeping their word. They're going to swear by anything and everything. Then, once again, he makes the right application, verse 19. He says, you blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? He says, which one's really more important? Because you can have 1,000 offerings, but if you don't have a place to offer it where it makes it holy, what good is it? You're swearing and saying, well, gold really is what makes it matter. Oh, it's the offering that really makes it matter. He said, no, it doesn't. You don't even recognize the holiness of God. Now, if you take this back, I know we made this application a few months ago. Which one's more important? Is it the worship that we offer or Jesus that makes the worship acceptable? You realize, without Jesus, what does it turn all the worship into? Pointless, empty, nothing. Because if we're not responding to Jesus, it's not going to make anything holy. But for them, they're swearing by all these things. Then he continues on. Look at verse 20. He says, therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. He says, you can't divide it out. He's just trying to divide things that make no sense. Then he continues on. He says, and whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. Oh, you're going to swear on God? Well, and you realize there's actually a story that we'll get to here in a little bit about people who blasphemed God. And you go, you think swearing by God would be a good idea? Like you have control over him? Now, this just tells you about the climate that Jesus was dealing with in people who had been raised up, looking up to people who were this way. Now, once again, he continues on, verse 22. He says, and whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Oh, he says, you're so blind, you might just jump off a cliff and enjoy the ride. Now, you get to this point, and I want to skip down to verse 27, because this is really what's going on in all these things. Then there's bigger things here too. But verse 27, because of how blind of guides they are, look at what Jesus says. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. What's coming? A judgment. I mean, woes. He says, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. It's like, don't you think they could read those same passages in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and realize the statements of saying, if you're not going to keep your vow, you're profaning the name of God? Did they seem to pick up on that? No, because they were doing it their own way for righteousness. And was it having an effect on Israel? I mean, I know this may sound laughable in some senses, but whenever you start to interact in terms of transactions with people that you can't trust, what does it do to you? Does it make for more stability? No, it makes you wonder, is anything going to happen here? I mean, how many people are willing to pay for the job before they can even start it? No. Not the place we live, right? And you realize, if that's the world that we deal with, don't we have to be a people who honor God even in the words and promises that we make? If you notice here in 27 as it continues, it says, you're a bunch of hypocrites. You're not going to make it in the kingdom of heaven. He says, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful. Now, how did the Pharisees look on the outside to a lot of the Israelites and Jews? Man, they're beautiful. I see them out there praying on the street corner, and they have such beautiful prayers. Can you hear people make statements like that? He says, they appear beautiful, like whitewashed tombs. He says, but inside they're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. He says, but if you really look on the inside, what's there? I want you to think, don't we do the same thing at cemeteries? I mean, we have decoration days, and I'm not saying anything against that. But just understand, all this ornate headstones, tombs, flowers, engravings, and you go, and it really makes things look really nice. But what do you know is on the inside of every coffin? Just dead bones, right? Now, and here he says even uncleanness. He takes it a step further just in case they couldn't make the application. Because whenever somebody's blind, you really got to go the extra length. Verse 28, he says, so you too, just in case they wondered who he's talking about. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men. And they were really good at looking that way. They went out of their way with so many other things that Jesus brings up in Matthew 23. He says, all these things, he says, outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. You're just a bunch of outlaws. You do it your own way. You kind of think about how many kids looked up to old Western outlaws. Any surprise? Didn't turn out much better in the next generation, did it? Now, you see what Jesus is going after here. He says, this is how spiritually blind people go about this. Now, look over at James chapter 5. Now, if you remember what we looked at in past weeks, Jesus calls his apostles before this Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, happened. So you know who's present. All the 12 are there to hear this Sermon on the Mount. So this should come as no surprise to us. James chapter 5, look down at verse 12. But above all, now think about that. He says, all these things that he's discussed through the book of James, and this is chapter 5, this is getting down towards the end. He says, but above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. But your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. How serious is God about us keeping our word? And if we don't, who are we profaning? Our God. Marlene, do you have a question? Okay, all right. I thought I heard. Okay. So, you notice here, is that really the way we think? And I know I make this same application often because I keep on hearing the same things happen. As parents, when you promise things to your children, what had you better do? You better keep it. If you tell them one more time, and I will, well, I didn't promise. Well, I didn't swear. Did you give your word? How many times as parents do you see one more time turn into 30 more times and parents still doesn't do anything? And then they get surprised that their kids go, it doesn't matter. They don't keep their word anyway. And parents wonder, how come they don't trust me? How come they don't listen? Thought about keeping your word? If it applies to parents, who else does it also apply to? What about grandparents? Great-grandparents get included, Marlene. And you, and you realize how easy is it as a grandparent to want to say, oh, yeah, we'll go do this. And then we never do it. Yep. Gabrielle. Way to go. It is. And you realize whenever, it is quite a statement whenever you hear a kid go, but you said you would. And you go, is that on the kid for remembering? Or is that on the parent? Kathy, did you have something or are you just getting a drink? All right. So whenever you start to realize through this, and it doesn't just affect parenting. I mean, what if you promise your neighbor something? What if you tell some stranger something? Is it not the same? I mean, can you imagine going through a place and here's a gas station, maybe it's Thanksgiving, and somebody says, boy, you know, I really miss being with my family and getting a good meal. And someone says, hey, you know, I'll bring you back a plate from our gathering. You don't know their name? Stranger. What are you going to do? You better fall through with it. If you tell somebody you will, we better make sure, number one, is this something that I can do? Is it within my power to do? And number two, am I going to keep my word? Or am I going to profane my God? Because those are the options. And we can start making up all the excuses we want, but it doesn't change the justice of God. And don't you just flat out love that this is how God sees this? Because it also means He will always keep His promise. Always. Now, come back over to Matthew chapter 5. Now, you can understand in verse 37, let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. And to think, James got to hear that himself. And then whenever he gets to write the book of James, to go, above all else, don't leave this out, because this is so important. And I want you to think about what we know about God. The things that's said in Hebrews, two unchangeable things. God's not going to lie. Isn't that the way we ought to be known? It is quite something. There are people that you know that whenever they tell you something, you don't have to go look it up. You don't have to double check it. You know, that's the way it is. They don't make things up. They don't shade them to be the way they want them to be. That's the way we should be known as God's people. The same way that our God is known. His name. Because that's who we're standing in, is in His name. Now, he says, anything beyond these is of evil. Verse 38. Matthew 5, verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, you've heard that. Have you heard that? It goes around a lot. I don't know about you. I find it very interesting whenever an ungodly world quotes biblical principles. Does that ever go, that's interesting. I'm glad to hear somebody's listening to something. And you look at it here and you go, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth really about? Revenge. It really goes back to even in terms of justice. Now, let's take a little bit of time. We'll try. All right. Go back to the Old Testament real quickly. I want to show you a couple of these. Because in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, you realize the things that Jesus is talking about. Exodus 21. Exodus 21, starting in verse 22. This is another one of those principles that wasn't just in one place in the Old Testament. It was over and over and over again, as if, how could you miss this? Well, Exodus 21, starting in verse 22. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, so what's the state of the woman? She's pregnant. She's with child. He says, and two men struggle so that she gives birth prematurely. In other words, she gets injured in part of this. He says, yet there is no injury. He shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. He says, either you make it right now or we'll make it right before the judges. He says, choice. Verse 23. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life. What if two men struggle and it affects the woman's life? Now, there's going to be a judgment here. Then notice the next aspect. Does this also include the idea about the child? Because notice it says, so that she gives birth prematurely. Oh, she goes into early labor because of what's happened. He says, yet there is no injury. He says, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband made demand of him. You go, here's a child that's born prematurely, but the child's still got good health. He says, is there still going to be a fine to pay? Yep, and you're going to have to agree on it with the man that you were just fighting with. Oh, how does that sound? This is not going to be easy. Then, he says, and if you can't figure it out, we're going to take this before a judge. Then, verse 23. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. You just imagine if that child is born prematurely and has a deformed hand, what's it going to cost you if you're that other man who caused the injury? Your hand. What if that child is born but dies? What's it going to cost you? What is God trying to protect here? Justice. The child, the woman who's carrying the child, and you realize the husband, all this gets included, right? But you notice, burn for burn makes it a little bit of a limitation here. You go, how could this newborn child have a burn? So you realize that's not part of that. But you look at it as a total picture and go, this is about justice. Look at another one, Leviticus chapter 24. Leviticus 24. Start in verse 17. If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. That's pretty simple, isn't it? He says, the one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. What if you kill another man's animal? You're responsible. He says, if a man injures his neighbor just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. What if I injure my neighbor because of my recklessness? And you realize, I hope you have not had this happen to you. You imagine somebody who comes along and an animal darts out in front of the road and then you hit the animal. Who has responsibility? And you think, here's another thing, you go, oh man, that dog should have been fenced up. But notice here, and there are some exceptions like that with oxen in the Old Testament, about if they were known for goring. The first time, okay. The next time, you should have tied that thing up. So there are some exceptions like that, Judy. But here's the picture of going, you know what? If I injured my neighbor or his animal, I'm responsible. And understand for this, we're probably not talking about dogs. We're probably talking about something like an oxen who actually helps plow the field that produces the food that you get to eat. You realize this is a big cost. I mean, we think about some animals having a much bigger responsibility in terms of what happens in terms of the food chain. He says, the one who takes his life for an animal shall make it good, life for life. A man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Now, you imagine, you knock your neighbor's tooth out in the fight. What does he get to do? Whew. I've never done that trying. But you imagine you broke the forearm of your neighbor, and now it's his right to do that to you? What's going to keep it from being a compound break? Well, now it's going to come back around and go, all right, well, now I get to compound break yours. Do you see what happens? At some point, what needs to happen? Blessed are those who are merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Even backtracking, in keeping your word, if there is a hunger and a thirst for righteousness, what will happen? You'll be satisfied. You'll drive to keep your word all the way. Now you see here of going, here's the picture of going, is anybody going to show mercy? There's another one, and we probably know it a little bit better. You can write down Deuteronomy 19, verses 18 through 21, and it's about a false witness. If someone comes to bear false witness in a court case, whatever penalty was being sought after the one who's being put on trial now gets applied to you for your false witness. Now, you think, what does that say? Here's God saying, I'm going to protect justice. And it may cost you. And once again, same thing, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. So if you're going after the life punishment and you're going to bear witness, what had you better make sure of? Every word I'm telling you is true. Because if I lie, who's it going to cost? Me, my life. And you realize, oh, wouldn't that be a great rule to have these days? It would certainly stop a lot of people from saying a lot of things. Because somebody's going to get found out, and it would be known. He says, and what do you think that would do to everybody else? Okay. I'm not going to make any assumptions. He says, we're going to have to do it this way. Now, come back over to Matthew chapter 5. Yes? Right. Now, it won't use the word murder. Murder is always about premeditated. If they're killed, it'll use that. Yes. And you're right, there are other places. If you remember the 6 cities of refuge in the Promised Land, if you accidentally killed your neighbor, it uses examples like if you're out chopping wood and the head of the axe flies off and kills your neighbor, you had no ill intent against them and they die, you have to flee to one of those 6 cities. Otherwise, the family member can chase you down if you don't go and bring about a retribution for the life of their loved ones, which tells you, boy, those 6 cities were quite a place to be. I mean, people, and I want you to think about that in a genuine sense, people would be in those cities of refuge who were carrying around some burdens of going, I killed somebody, but it was definitely not on purpose. I mean, you can kind of imagine nowadays, I hear this from time to time, somebody driving along, and someone who is aiming to take their own life jumps out in front of your car. And you go, well, I didn't want to do that. I didn't aim to do that. But yet at the same time, there's some false guilt of going, man, well, what if I would have just stayed home that night? Or what if, and you realize all those things are being dealt with. In those 6 cities of refuge, wouldn't you have some similar things? I knew I should have tightened that head on the axe. I should have known better. But I didn't intend to it. And you realize some of those same things being dealt with. So those cities of refuge are kind of unique little thoughts. And so what Karen brings up, there were some exceptions in this, but it is not about you intentionally struggling with another man, or you killed your neighbor aiming to do so, or you became a false witness on purpose at a trial. All those things are intentional, and that's what he's really dealing with through these 3. Back here in Matthew chapter 5, I want you to notice this idea of the mercy. Verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, if you think about Matthew 26, verses 68 and 69, do you remember what they were doing to Jesus? They were slapping him. Remember what they were even saying? If you're the Christ, tell us who it is who hit you. Is he letting them do it again? They even spit on him. Can you imagine the warmth of the spit actually going down his body? And yet, what's he going to let them do? Hit him again, slap him again. Is Jesus going to live by what he's saying here? Yes, he is. He is not going to be a hypocrite, even at far-reaching extents. Look at the next statement here in verse 40. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Think about John chapter 19. Remember the 4 soldiers and the centurion that are there at the foot of the cross? They took Jesus' outer garments off of him, and it says they divided them into 4 pieces, one for each of the soldiers, which tells you there's 4 soldiers there. And then it says, but his outer coat, he says, it was without a seam. It was woven as one garment, and they didn't want to divide it out. And so what do they do for it? They cast lots to see which one of the 4 would get to keep it. Now, do you see the application? If anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Here's Jesus. You took my clothes, and you took my outer garment too. Jesus say a word about that? No. Are they suing him? No. He says, even if it doesn't go that far, you can have it. Then, verse 41, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Think about in the life of Jesus. Isn't he completely worn out in getting out to Calvary to the point that he can't even carry his own cross? And Simon of Cyrene picks it up and takes it from there. And Jesus goes further. But really, the best application of this is in Luke chapter 24. You remember the 2 on the road to Emmaus? Cleopas is one of the men. The other one's not really named. Jesus is there. They don't recognize this is Jesus after his resurrection. They're walking out to Emmaus, and it talks about Jesus appeared like he was going to go further. But they said, come in and eat with us. It's already late. And so Jesus came in and ate with them. And whenever they started to eat, he blessed the bread and he broke it. And that's the moment they recognized who he was. It had been completely aloof to them until that point. But to realize Jesus wanted to go further, but they said, come in and stay with us and eat with us. And so what did he do? He went the extra mile, so as to say, and he sat down with them. Other plans, but instead, I'll be here with you. You realize the applications of these things are all through the life of Jesus, of going one step further, going another mile. Then, once again, verse 42, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, we'll start really here next week, and we'll look over at Luke, but I want you to think about this. Give to him who asks of you. How many people came to Jesus and asked for him to help them? And he said no. Now, there is one story about a Syrophoenician woman that gets you a little curious, but he does cure, and he uses her as a faithful servant to take care of and show a lesson to his disciples. But realize, don't you see this is what Jesus does? It's one thing when you just hear, hey, don't you know you should go the second mile? And we go, yeah, but how far do I really have to go? I'm tired. Well, you can imagine Jesus, I just raised from the dead. And yet, what does he do? He does it, right? What's our excuse? Right? Because who are we looking at? We're looking at ourselves rather than looking at who our God is and who we need to be. You see how Jesus is really dealing with things? that have to be dealt with? You're going to let self be in control? You're going to tell lies? You're going to make false oaths because you want to appear to be something that you're really not? He says, better be careful. Better be careful. All right. Next time we gather together, we'll start in 42 and 43 together. All right. Have a good rest of the week.